Okay, Kristen? Well, you watch movies in here, right? So we're okay. Don't tell anyone we had food in here. Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Silverman, and I'm a freelance journalist in town and a member of the National Center on Disability and Journalism Board, the only board I've ever joined in my 30-year journalism career, because I feel that strongly about it. And we are going to have a little media panel here today, and we are lucky to have so many members of the media that I hope you will join in when we are talking about stories. You know, I don't know that we'll have too much time for Q&A, but if you have a story experience that you want to share, please raise your hand and do so. So we're going to start with introductions. We have Stina and Maria and Gabe here. I'm going to let them tell you who they are and a little bit about what they do, and then we'll take it from there. Stina.
My name is Stina Sieg. I'm a senior field correspondent, which is a fancy word for reporter at KJZZ, the NPR affiliate in town. And you will sometimes hear my voice on really short stories we call newscast pieces, spots, something 45 seconds, 30 seconds. But for the most part, my main job is doing feature stories. And so I do a lot of human interest feature stories. And I try to tell stories that you haven't heard before, and you should definitely hear, but you might not have any other outlet for hearing them.
My name is Maria Paletta. I'm a reporter for the Arizona Republic and azcentral.com. Up until last month, for 2 years, my beat was diversity and inequality issues. So that included covering disability issues. I recently switched to covering state politics, which right now is very election heavy and nasty. But after we get through the general election, we'll go back to looking at inequality issues from more of a state policy lens.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabe Trujillo. I'm a digital content producer for 12 News here in Phoenix. My main responsibility is working with the social digital team to produce articles and content for our website, as well as manage all the content on our social sites. So you'll see my byline on the 12news.com website every once in a while, but our main purpose is to publish content from all our reporters and talent.
So not everybody who covers disability has a personal connection to it. Some of us do. My daughter, Sophie, is 15 years old. She has Down syndrome, and she was the first person with Down syndrome I'd ever met. And even though I had been basically a general assignment reporter at New Times for 11 years, covering you name it, I covered it. When she was born and diagnosed, I realized I had never written about Down syndrome, which is a little awkward. Much more awkward was having her be the first person with Down syndrome I'd ever met. She's taught me a lot about it and definitely has given me much more of an appreciation for the importance of disability journalism. I wish that it was something I'd come to on my own, but the truth is I came to it through Sophie. So I'm grateful to her for many things, and that is one of them. So do you all have any connections you want to talk about?
I don't have a lot of personal connections. I feel like for me, I started in this business when I was 21. So the things that have informed me is just the people I've met along the way. And in each job, each year of me being a journalist, I've met people with disabilities who've shaped how I talk about people with disabilities and things I've gotten right and things I've gotten wrong. And so I feel like I carry that with me all the time. So I feel like the people from the past that I knew, I feel like I owe it to them to get future stories right for people that they will never meet and probably will never even read or hear the story. But it's like, I'm doing this for, a girl who was 25 who had cerebral palsy. Like, sorry. We can move on.
I'll actually hand it over to Gabe. My answer is pretty similar because before, I didn't have personal experience in terms of me or my immediate family, friends, people I had worked with, yes. But in terms of getting really in depth into the issues and experiences, it wasn't until I started reporting and made an effort to focus on that.
Well, I have a very deep connection with disability. My interaction with disability started in 1997 I became a quadriplegic after a severe asthma attack, weirdly enough. I ended up spending 8 months in the hospital, and when I woke up after a 4-day coma, doctors told me I couldn't move my arms or legs. So it's been a long ride. I could have a whole other panel talking about my actual diagnosis, but we'll leave it at that. So I've spent the last 21 years in a wheelchair and encountered numerous issues of people with disabilities, and I have a unique perspective on it.
Definitely. And how old were you when it happened?
I was 14 years old, freshman in college, or high school. I had just started within like a month into my freshman year of high school, and I became a quad and ended up having to take classes in the hospital while I was recovering. So I was managed to stay on time and graduate high school on time.
So here's a question I'd love to open up to everyone as well. But panelists, how do you find disability angles in your stories? Maria, you want to?
So this is similar to what I heard Jen saying a little bit ago, but there's almost always a disability angle to something. Most recently, I guess my final story for the inequality beat that I just had out was related to domestic violence shelters and facilities. I mean, you
really good
shared
story.
that, and how they're essentially, despite good intentions, not equipped to accept or serve well survivors with disabilities, which creates this added layer for an already vulnerable population that might be hesitant to leave, and then there were cases of people going back to abusive situations because they were struggling to communicate and so forth in these facilities. So a lot of pitches I get, whether it's from transportation, health issues. There was that when the HUD rent increases were proposed for like housing subsidies and Section 8 vouchers and so forth, I looked at those formulas and who it was going to affect, and sure enough, it was low-income people and people with disabilities and older adults. So checking that
So that
out.
was a number crunching idea, but can you talk about how you got the idea to do the story about the situation at the domestic violence shelters?
So that was a little different because I did get, I was told about a new leaf starting, they had applied for a grant and got funding to outfit their facilities with tools and kits specifically for survivors who were deaf and hard of hearing. And so I got sort of pitched on, hey, we're doing this new thing. And rather than just write a story about that made me think, okay, well, if they didn't have this, what else don't they have? Do other facilities not have it? Right. Which
is such a unique thing.
Right, absolutely. And of course, I mean, the story that came out wasn't, to slam domestic violence facilities or anything like that, but just to look into that layer and sort of what the broader situation was, I expanded it that way.
What kind of response did you get to that story?
I got a good response. I'm trying to think how to say it because it's one of those things where it's good in terms of people reaching out to you, bad in terms of them saying they identify with what you wrote about. So I did hear from people saying, thank you so much for writing this. This is something that's totally ignored. It got shared a lot on Twitter. I got some personal emails, emailed back and forth with readers. So I did get good feedback on that in terms of that not being an issue that gets covered a lot.
Stina, what about you? Because you do a lot of enterprise reporting.
Yeah, and so I think I look at reporting on disability the way I look at reporting on anything else, where I take something that I have personal investment in and interest in, and then I look at how would I be experiencing this with a disability. I'm doing a series on hiking right now, and so I'm looking at, okay, if you were someone who wanted to hike and you had a physical disability that prevented you from doing it, how would you explore that? And that's like I don't know the answer to that. And so I'm looking for the various answers to that. And I'm really interested in art. So like one of the first stories I did with this girl who had cerebral palsy, I mean, she had been adopted and they didn't know she had cerebral palsy, and then started to present itself. And so her mom was like a single parent because the dad had left, and her mom found the way she could communicate with her is giving her things to do artistically. And so I because I'm so interested in art, I was talking to the art center and they introduced me to this girl, and I felt, for me, reporting disabilities, it's like a natural progression of what I already do, because all these things that I love, like I want to know how you would experience that if you didn't have the full faculties that I had in certain. See, I feel like I'm going to trip with all the language. I'm sorry.
Also, just, I mean, speaking to more broadly of just the way you find out about other stories, people complaining about things, people complaining on Facebook and Twitter. I did a story on rideshare services, Uber and Lyft, not accepting service animals, even though they're legally supposed to, and not making some other accommodations. And that came out of somebody on Facebook saying, you know, I've been left standing there twice, you know, when Lyft has shown up, and I've been standing there with my service dog.
But
So
you can bring your dog in the grocery store, and when it's definitely not your service animal. Sorry.
Right.
Pet peeve.
It has that service vest on it.
No,
And
not
little
even, right?
Gabe, did you?
Well, I think with me kind of being in the newsroom, I try and make it as much of a point to interact and include the perspective of someone from disability. It's not by default. I just feel, since I'm in the newsroom, I have that unique perspective that I can give to editors and sort of direct them into certain angles. For example, we recently did a story on a young person who was actually gotten the opportunity to hike up Camelback Mountain. This is a few months ago. Bianca Bono did this story on it, and they sort of phrased it around oh, look how inspiring that is. This group of firefighters put together this contraption that they could carry up this girl up Camelback Mountain. And after we ran the story, I went over and explained it to Bianca and the editors that maybe instead of making every piece on disability so inspirational, maybe talk about like how could other people who have disabilities go up and hike that mountain? Because I brought up the point like I don't have any life-threatening illnesses, but I would like to hike up Camelback Mountain one day, and it's not necessarily going to be inspirational. I mean, everybody hikes, so I thought it would be kind of an informational story for people to learn how to do that if they do have the opportunity to do so.
So to make it more instructive rather than inspirational.
Yeah,
and did
absolutely.
you get good response to that?
They did. I mean, it's a never-ending battle. We
Where's
have
the
this
story?
Yeah, we think we have this thing in the newsroom where it's essentially revolves around would Dolores be interested in watching this, and so at first people are like, well, it's a kid with a disability. I mean, they want to feel empowered by having this person being able to do this and give them that sense of inspiration. But I try and push like, well, you need to realize that not everybody's there to provide inspiration, and there's another angle you can provide that would still do a service to Dolores. Like maybe she has a grandson that lives in a wheelchair that could use this opportunity to get inspiration for himself to go out and hike that mountain if they had the resources to do so.
Yeah. Stina, you did a story. Oh, somebody have a yes.
It's a little devil's advocate, but it's kind of on topic, and I just wanted to ask. I've done a lot of events in the past with the service dog conundrum. And one of the challenges when you're on the other side of that table with this issue is that you get a lot of people that just because they bought a vest off of the internet now think they have a service dog, and you have, it's a very fine line to walk. And how do you take a stand against that? And what would be the story for that? How do you not offend that person that actually needs that dog as a true resource, and differentiate between that person that just wants to bring their dog along because, you know, Fluffy has to be with me all the time, and not offend either side? It's really kind of a slippery slope. How would you how would you address that?
We have, and I didn't personally do these stories, I helped on them, so I'm trying to remember, but we've done those stories. I know there were some efforts the last legislative session to address this issue, and we just made sure that, I mean, it sounds like a duh answer, but that we were talking to everybody involved, that we were talking to people, you know, with disabilities or with service animals about, hey, when people do this is the impact it has on me, you know, sort of the this is why we can't have nice things argument, right?
Mm-hmm. Has a legitimate need for
Absolutely.
that service, to trivialize it almost
Right.
by thinking that And really, it's not to slight anyone. You know, everybody has their own issues, but that goes back to the point of everybody has their own issues, you know?
It's a great one to tackle. Yeah, so I would imagine it'll come up again.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and again and again. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Stina, you did a story about a theater company for people with developmental disabilities called Detour. And that, I'm just curious about what the experience was doing that story. There's a lot, I've been there, literally I've been to Detour, and there's a lot that goes on to put on one of those productions. There are a lot of people to interview.
Oh my
We've
God,
talked
yeah.
about that a little bit today, about the challenges and trying to do trying to do the right thing, really. Can you talk about what that experience was like?
Yeah, that experience was, well, for me, going to a rehearsal, it's like this really controlled chaos.
Can you explain?
Oh, yes.
Explain a little bit what Detour is.
So Detour is this theater company where they put on these like really big, massive, beautiful, colorful shows. They're always musicals.
They're always musicals.
And so you have these people's various disabilities, and they all have, or most of them have, like I'm not sure what the word is. It's like a helper, who's also on stage, and. It's just there are these really beautiful musicals that people come. You think it's like their family comes, but then people just from across the community will come, and there's so much energy to it, and it's all kind of put together by this woman named Sam, who's like such a believer, and she's like everyone's mom, and so you come to one of these rehearsals thinking, okay, I'm going to do a story, and you don't know where to start, and Sam kind of shepherds you into like, here, maybe talk to these people and these people, but. Doing that story was really important for me because I don't know what the correct term would be, but I think sometimes we talk about like inspiration porn. And it's like, when you go in there, everyone's taking it so seriously that if you were to bring this like schmaltzy angle, you would not be taking them seriously. You'd be doing a complete disservice because everyone's so invested in what they do, from the volunteers who do not have some of whom do not have disabilities, to the people who have these various disabilities. So it was a very challenging story, and but I was also so moved. So I'm like there, like holding my mic and like crying, like it was just like, oh my God, like just
So we've talked a lot today about the language surrounding disability, and one of the main pieces of advice that NCDJ gives in the style guide is, if you're not sure how to refer to somebody, ask them. Say, do you want to be referred to as a person with autism, or do you want to be referred to as autistic? Do you want to be referred to as hard of hearing or deaf? But then there are people where it's not necessarily possible to ask them, or to not ask them in a traditional way. So how do you address something like that? Not just asking them how they want to be referred to, but including somebody in a meaningful way in a story when you can't communicate with them so traditionally.
So with that story, I didn't ask anybody what their disability was.
Right, but in terms of just approaching them.
Oh, totally. So I think I got some guidance from the director, from Sam, about who would be eager to talk to me, who would be, able to talk to me in this sort of like traditional putting a microphone in front of them being able to express themselves verbally or not. I got some guidance from her, but I just asked people like who wants to tell me about themselves, and people were so excited, and so I tried to give as much space to have people introduce themselves. This is who I am. This is why I like it here. And I felt with that story in particular, it was just so important for me not to put a spin on it. Just like, you tell me why this matters to you. And then, obviously as the reporter, I'm going to talk about why, sort of how it matters to the community, maybe some of how it matters to me. But I feel like that was very much, I had to just give them space to tell their own story, and then I could just corral it as much as made sense. Yeah.
Maria, how do you approach that? How do you approach getting to people with disabilities to talk to them for stories?
When I'm actually like already there in person, or in terms of connecting with them to ensure they're in the stories?
Finding sources, because that can be a challenge,
Right.
and then once you're there.
Yeah, with sourcing, of course, like, once you start doing stories and start establishing a network, that's always good. Also, asking for a real person when you get a more generic press release and things like that. I've also tried to go and show up to events that I'm invited to when I'm not looking to get a story out of it, and talk to people just so they know that I'm not sort of trying to use them for a one-off story. I mean, sometimes that's unavoidable because you get an assignment or whatever, you don't have lead time, but when possible, I try to do that. In terms of once I'm already in person with somebody, I don't know how much valuable insight I have to share there, because I tend to sort of do the pre-work in terms of ensuring it's somebody who wants to and is in a position to talk to me. So I kind of do that on the front end.
When you're not doing real featurey work,
Right,
right?
yeah,
Where you
so
just
it's a little
walk into
different
a
in my
room with
case.
100 people and have to figure out who
Yeah.
to talk to.
Yeah.
Gabe?
I mean, I kind of follow Maria's sentiments there with that. Also, in my circumstances, I already have kind of a built-in network of people with disabilities that I know personally that would be a good source for a story. Also, if they're unable to talk, or if I find somebody else where I need some additional sourcing, I reach out to people within their social circles who might know that person a little bit easier, that could provide some additional input as far as how they think that they would want to be recognized as, or ideally sort of.
I find Facebook stalking is very effective.
Yes.
Abby?
I wanted to pose a slightly different question to Stina on the detour. So that theater company is designed for individuals with disabilities, right? The majority of, or all of the participants.
All of the actors.
If a story pitch had come from Valley Youth Theater, who had one of their performers in one of their upcoming shows was a child that was a wheelchair user, A, would you have covered the story? And B, what would your angle have been, given the fact that that was the unique part of that play, was we have a kid in a wheelchair in our play, and that's why they pitched you the story.
That's a great question.
And
And I'm glad I don't have to answer.
Thinking about it, because again, that was sort of the discussion I was leading, was we're the PR people for these organizations trying to find the pitch, and kid with disability and my mainstream theater company sounds like a good story pitch.
It is a good story.
So how would you have reacted had that same pitch come and from a mainstream theater company versus the other?
it's a good question. I think that I really love stories about things that people love. So for me, that kind of a story would be interesting for talking to that kid and be like, tell me why you love theater, and having it be focused on him or on her. But I think also the practical elements of being in a wheelchair is not some giant disability, so this idea that there would probably be all these obstacles to even just to that one, just to a wheelchair, there would probably be these obstacles about even having that kid on stage. I think that'd be interesting as well. But I think I'd have to really have a conversation with them about just about the story in general before I proceeded. Because just being in a wheelchair, I wouldn't want to go down a road that was this is not, I'm not slamming TV news at all, but there is a stereotype of bad TV news where it verges on that kind of inspiration porn. And I think that that's not fair to anybody, even to that kid. You want to give them the very best story possible. And you want to talk about our shared humanity. You don't want to talk about, oh, isn't that great, blah, blah, blah. You want to really go there. So if I was able to really go there, I would be totally into it.
I feel like what we've learned today is that wouldn't be enough of a pitch necessarily.
Yeah.
We got to have more reasons that makes it a great pitch. Gabe?
I mean, it's definitely interesting. One angle that I would consider pursuing it is sort of along lines of inclusion, maybe focusing on what they're doing to make sure that these kids have the same opportunity to utilize their club just like everyone else, and maybe talk about other ways other organizations can focus on inclusion and how they can include other people with disabilities.
You know, it could also end up being a story where someone says, okay, how long has Valley Youth Theater been around? Okay, that
Exactly.
many years. How many times has a kid with a wheelchair taken the stage? Okay, good, you know, good to know, and why. And then maybe you find sources who had issues. I mean, some, you know, I hate to say some story idea was backfire, but.
I mean, like, we would cover that. But for us, the story angle would be, you know, all of those things. Valley Youth Theater's been around for forever, and here we are. And, you know, what kind of obstacles are there to getting on and off the stage? And how are we adapting the script? And what's the next script you're going to challenge? What's the next one you're going to do? And you know, have you met Teal Shear and Natalie Stoker? And are you know, what are your bigger plans? The same thing I'd ask any other aspiring actor who caught my attention.
Yeah. So, did anybody else want to address that?
I would just want to say that it's one of those stories that could be so amazing, or you could mess it up so badly, you know, and it's like, you know.
Well, and it also depends, like we're talking about how Stina is more of a feature reporter. It may end up being, I don't want to say an investigative story, but that kind of idea could definitely spark a bigger story where you survey children's theater companies in a city and find out how often kids with disabilities are included. Detour is awesome in a lot of ways. My daughter's part of Detour. She would like nothing more than to be cast in her High School Musical. So there's different ways to approach stories. It doesn't always have to just be featuring. Not that features aren't amazing, particularly
So
in your
offended.
hands.
No, I was just going to agree with you because that's a conversation that we've had in my newsroom, particularly in the sports stories. Down syndrome boy gets to shoot last basket, right? Does that boy have an opportunity to play sports otherwise? So that's not always the most feel-good story because sometimes it does take an investigative bent, but we try and look at the context there. And also whether sort of how the kid himself or the individual, him or herself, feels about it. Is it something that they're excited about? I know you wrote about this with the prom with your daughter, I think, versus somebody who's trying to sell it as a great experience for them
Right.
without hearing from the individual.
Right. That's a really good point. So I'm wondering, what sort of responses do you get in the newsroom from editors when you pitch stories that have to do with disability? Gabe, you talked about it a little bit. Do you regularly say, hey, you guys, you know, here's something you should go check out, and how is it received?
I occasionally try to pitch these disability stories. I'm sort of balancing or going over the tightrope of, do I want to be known as, that senior disability correspondent all around the newsroom, or do I want to actually be perceived as just another one of those journalists that are there pitching stories? So I try and include insight when I can, when I think that it would be a benefit to not just me, but to the newsroom as well. So it's a never-ending battle with that. But I try and offer my input as much as I can to make sure that disability stories are covered. When I do pitch them, it's still a fight to justify why the station should cover it, just because it's such a niche audience that not everybody's going to want to hear about that kind of thing. So, yeah.
And this may be an inappropriate question, but I mean, aren't you kind of glad that they don't say, oh, sure, Gabe, of course. We'll do that disability story. Thank you. I mean, you always want all your ideas challenged, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's good because then not only does it force me to go in and effectively pitch this story, but it gives me the chance to make sure that the story is of high importance and I can still get them to angle, because if we start pitching or doing every single disability story, it will kind of water down the effectiveness of the story that's being told.
Totally. So, Stina, you're kind of general assignment, right?
Yeah.
You don't have a beat. So how is it received, and how do you think about it before you pitch a story having to do with disability?
It's been received pretty well. I think that the fact that we have sort of a void in our newsroom, my coworker Kathy Ritchie does some disability
She
stories.
does amazing work.
Yes, exactly. And she's really good at telling stories that nobody else is telling in our newsroom. So, but I think, I mean, I'm sure there have been other disability stories, but I can only think of hers and mine right now. So we're kind of seeing a little bit, like if we pitch it to our editor, I think they take it seriously because they know that we're taking it seriously. So I've had really good luck. But the thing you always have to fight against is there are only so many people with this disability. Will people who don't have the disability care? And I think I just go back to shared humanity. Like, I think it matters to us all. Like,
It's important
yeah.
no matter what the story
Well,
idea
exactly,
is, right? You have to
exactly,
figure
exactly.
out how to take the specificity and make it have universal appeal.
Exactly.
No matter what the topic is. Yeah. Oh, no, Maria, did you want
No, I totally agree with that. And, you know, as I've said, I tend to have more of like the watchdog side. So anything that I can ground in sort of that angle or that framing, anything that I can get data on, anything that has a compelling character, as we call it, to sort of build a story around. That's how I tend to pitch it. It's usually well received, and something that has helped that be more well received is having had a panel discussion where we had people, of course not expecting them to speak for the entire community, but 6 people with physical disabilities of different types come in and audit our coverage and tell us how we were messing up, what we were doing well, which stories we were missing. And it's funny how you can say something to editors for like 5 years, and then as soon as somebody from the community comes in and says the exact same thing, it's a new and great idea. But I mean, I'm happy because I have seen a shift since we've heard, you know, from readers and heard directly from the community with that. What has been less well received, because I'm on our diversity committee, which sort of has that daily role of auditing our coverage, is pointing out inspiration porn, pointing out terminology that's wrong or outdated. Of course, nobody, and especially, you know, with the instability of the industry right now, nobody wants to have corrections and be corrected. I don't like to mess up. It's embarrassing. But I have to remember that sort of my responsibility in that diversity committee role is not to, you know, beyond professional courtesy and respect, is not to my coworkers. It's to people, you know, in the community who are readers who are not in that room at that time.
we're always serving the reader. Not in it to make friends, even in your own newsroom, right? Anybody else want to talk about experiences you've had pitching stories in your newsrooms?
So I work with the elderly actually, and so many of these people, they get their disabilities later in life because of age-related aging. So like they're in a wheelchair, or they lose their hearing, stuff like that. And when I first started working at the nonprofit that I called you at, that I work at, I'm the public relations coordinator, and I honestly was like, there's no way I'm going to, sal's not the best word, but there's no way I'm going to get any of this in the media because it's not sexy. You know, no one's like, yay, caregiving, or yay, elderly issues. That's so exciting. But what I've been pleasantly surprised about is if you do a good quality job, this is from the PR side, if you do a good quality job, you don't pitch fluff, and you pitch, and you treat journalists like they're people.
A novel concept.
Yeah. No matter what,
We
so
kind of are.
I'm also a journalist, so no matter what the issue is, you're gonna get at least a decent reception. So like we've had more coverage since I've been there than they had in previous years combined, and I think it's because I treat journalists like they're people. I don't mass pitch them. I only submit stuff if it's actually a story, you know. So the same principles that you learn in journalism 101, it's like even if the story isn't quote unquote sexy, because you know no one wants to hear about a lot of the stuff that we help people.
Right.
But if you do it with the same integrity that you would approach any story or any topic, I think that goes a long way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, anybody
want to talk about a newsroom. That's all wonderful points. A newsroom experience you've had, good, bad, or ugly.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I work in a newsroom. I'm at the Arizona Daily Star. I was trying to think. I haven't had negative experiences approaching my editors with stories.
Do you self-edit? I mean, you probably don't pitch like what kind of thought process do you put into it before you pitch it? Which may just be how you pitch every story.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of that Monday morning ritual of just saying this is what's on my schedule for this week. You know, what tickles your toes, and then talking about it. But certainly, I've never been shut down on doing a story, or I think in part because the woman who runs our newsroom is very sensitive to that. And so I'm sure that influences the climate at our newsroom. I don't know, but I've been pleased.
Sorry.
Oh, no, it seems like we get a lot of kind of the inspirational stories on one side, and then we get a lot of the investigative needs aren't being met on the other side. It'd be nice to see just more representation in the middle, in the everyday story, where you're in it because you are a citizen of our state, and it has nothing to do with your disability, and we hear from you and we see these people, because these other sides seem real heavy. The middle to me seems a little light.
I hope sometimes we are hearing from people with disabilities in stories, but particularly in print or on radio, we don't necessarily know.
Right.
Right? Yeah, so Gabe, so Jen Longden moderated a version of this panel the last time we had a conference, and so I asked her for some suggestions. So I'm totally blaming you. She said to ask you, are you looked at in your newsroom as the disabled journalist or the journalist who sometimes talks about disability?
After being in the newsroom for about 3 years now, I'm definitely the journalist with the disability. I haven't had instances yet where people come up and pitch me disabled story ideas or ask me questions about disability. You'll get those questions from reporters just in the asides, like, what's your disability? Like, can you tell me a little bit more about it? But I have yet to been approached and pitched ideas or like say, is this a good idea or whatnot.
How does your disability experience inform your experience as a journalist? If it does, it may not.
I wouldn't necessarily say it informs my experience as a journalist. I think it's given me some additional insights, but I don't necessarily have that in the forefront of my mind whenever I'm working as a journalist. If there are instances where my perspective is needed to maybe enhance a story, I'm more than willing to provide it, but I wouldn't necessarily say it makes me or defines the journalist role that I play.
Maria, without, because it's your beat, without giving away any of your own story ideas, you have any advice on anything anybody should be keeping an eye out for? Maybe just in the few weeks before you pick it back up again.
In terms of story ideas going forward,
Or just themes. Things that you wish that you would see in the media in general, having covered this.
Sources and phone numbers.
That too. Wait, no, those, just send those to me.
provide a list.
Yeah.
Oh, can Stina go? I need to think about this. Let me think for a second.
Stina,
do you have
what do you-
something off
what do
the
you
top
think?
of your head?
Well,
Or a way of approaching things.
to relate something we were talking about earlier, when I pitch something, I know that it's a good idea and that's probably going to work when my editor goes like, huh, I'd never thought about that before. But he says it in a real like way of like, that's like, he's really surprised that he's never thought about it before. Like, so when I think about the future, I think about, I want more stories that are about the everyday, like it's a story day that's just sitting right there and it's so obvious, but we've never talked about it. And I think there are so many stories. I can't even think of one in particular, but like I did a story about some blind activists, it's a blind couple and they have a daughter who has the same form of glaucoma that they have, she will lose her sight more and more as she gets older. But they just go and contact companies about how things don't work for them. And the companies, they really were never malicious. They just had never thought about it. That maybe it'd be good to have their grocery store online grocery, website make it accessible for someone who is blind. So I feel like those kinds of stories where it's like just sort of like gently waking people up.
The everyday stories that are right in front of our noses.
Yes.
Yeah, that seems like a really good place to.
Yeah, because accessibility, and that's, I know I was struggling too, because it's like it's so broad.
I put you on the spot. That one wasn't in the email.
But I know, I mean, with accessibility, and this sounds like it's coming from a watchdog perspective, which it is, but it's also human interest. I mean, anything with accessibility and the ADA, which even though it has been around for 30 years, no one is complying with. Like almost any area you look at, and it doesn't have to be a super deep investigative piece. It can be, expectant mothers who are deaf are not being provided interpreters when they go and have like prenatal exams. I mean, things like that you hear about. Pretty much any element that you could look at involving accessibility and accommodations, there's probably a story there. I also think keeping an eye out sort of for like the next frontier of accessibility issues. You just reminded me of this like website accessibility and claims there. I think new technology, there are a lot of benefits of it, but then that opens up a whole can of worms there, like with the rideshare services or whatever else, like we were talking about earlier.
Gabe?
One thing that I would like to see is just an in-depth feature on inspiration porn in and of itself. A lot of times I come across these conversations with reporters, and I brought it up to one in our newsroom, and they're like, well, what's inspiration porn?
They should have come to the conference.
I'm working on this. I'm working on this right now, actually.
Yeah, I'm actually working on one too, but different market.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible that these people don't really notice. Like, they just think it's second nature. Like, oh, there's another feel-good story about a guy in a wheelchair playing soccer or whatever. And I think once people realize that this is an issue and that people need to realize, I think it would help inform audiences everywhere. I mean, every time I have a conversation with one of my coworkers and I say, yeah, I was just at the grocery store the other day, and an old lady walked up to me and said, it's so nice to see you out. And they're like, well, what do you mean? And so I talk about it, and they're like, I can't believe you deal with this. And it's like, is it something you experience a lot? And I go, probably more often than you would think. I mean, another time I was at an In-N-Out Burger with my cousin eating a hamburger, and some guy walks up and says to my cousin, it's so nice that you're there helping him and letting him eat.
Or how I'm told very often that my 15-year-old daughter is an angel, and if you have a teenage child, you know that's not really necessarily true. Kristen.
It just made me think of another story idea, which is about language choices and how it changes so fast, and how even there's so much disagreement within the disability community because people don't know how to talk about it. And that actually might make an interesting story about the evolution of the language and what the new terms are and how people get offended or not offended by terms. I actually think that could be a good story.
Anybody else have any comments? Well, I think we're definitely all well versed in inspiration porn in this room after today and other issues, and we can go forth and share that hopefully with our newsrooms and with others, and share the style guide and that kind of thing. And really, I mean, I think it's about recognizing individual people, even if they don't always cross your path, even if it's harder to seek them out, even if you're afraid that you're going to say the wrong thing. I think it's better to go forward like we do on all stories, and find meaning, like we do in everything. So, thank you. Mary.
I just want to go back just for a sec to the emotional support animals. If you've never seen this story, it was in the New Yorker in 2014. And Patricia Marks went undercover with 5 different animals to try to... peacock, a llama, a giant tortoise. I mean, it's a good breed.
So I have one quick comment. We actually did some we provide training rather on service animals. You understand how much of my time is spent answering service animal questions because there's no authority. There's no.
Yeah.
It's not like you go to the police. People try. There's no authority, and so it's very confusing. So I think when we send out the email, the post-conference email, I'll attach a link to our recorded webinar. It's on YouTube. It's Arizona specific. We partner with the Arizona Center for Disability Law because there is so much confusion, but there's a lot of interest because it's an animal story, so it gets a lot of clicks.
We'll get a lot of hits.
And every single session and every single legislature in the spring, there will be a bill. Kavanaugh will probably introduce it, and so this is always topical. We'll attach it to the email.
That's a good transition.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.